Game economy is one of the most important core mechanics, essential both for the games of emergence to provide balancing and for the games of progression to support, well, progression. Economy in the real world is a system in which resources are produced, consumed, and exchanged in quantifiable amounts. That's the definition. The game economy is the same thing, but apart from money, goods, and services, which is similar to the real world, the game economy also includes things like health, lives, experience, skill. Generally, the entities in game economy can be divided into three distinct categories. Tangible resources are physical properties that can be directly found in the game world. So these are inventory items, collectibles, like just medical kits, trees in Warcraft. Then we have intangible entities, stuff that does not exist in the real world, but the player is directly informed about the possession of these resources. These are, for example, health points, power, skills, also lumber or timber in Warcraft. Please note that collected tangible resources can be directly exchanged into intangible resources. So, for example, a tangible medical kit may be converted into intangible health points. And last but not least, the abstract resources. The abstract resources are still measurable, still quite concrete in a game, but they are not directly communicated to the player. And this may be strategic advantage, this may be threat during the game. So this is also a very important category. Economy in games can be used, for example, and I think it is probably one of the most important reasons to use economy to balance games. And this will be particularly important for the games of emergence or the emergent aspects of games of progression, because emergent gameplay may be difficult to control in any other way. But using the economic aspect and particularly positive and negative feedback that I will discuss again in a few next few slides, these provide means for the game designer to specifically control the emergence in games and makes it possible to balance such a game. In games of progression, balancing is also very important. This is, for example, providing different sets of skills to different characters that wouldn't create any kind of winning strategy or something like that. But again, this balancing aspect is more often than not connected to the emergent aspect of these games or of the games of progression. Balancing games will be discussed in much more detail in the next lecture next week. And now we move on to complementing physics. Okay, physics is in many games the leading type of game mechanics, but again, elements like rewards and perhaps risks, power-ups can actually enhance this physics by attracting the player to some particular places and also deterring players from some other places by creating risks. This combined system of interrelated risks and rewards can actually be a very powerful tool in the hands of a game designer for directing or guiding the player across the level map. If you think about it, the reward, which may be the main game score, is quite often the main driving force for players to play the game and also the winning condition. Then the third of our uses of economy in games is to influence the progression. These are all kinds of power-ups, but first of all triggers and other collectibles. In the part of this lecture, when we discussed progression games and typical level layouts, we have discussed triggers, for example, keys to unlock closed doors. Okay, so all these triggers are a part of the game economy. And last but not least, the strategic gameplay. Strategic gameplay is, first of all, an aspect of strategic games, but of course not only. But in strategic games, it will be mostly visible. These games are very firmly based on the use of economy, mostly for planning and long-term investments that can be really awarded in this type of a gameplay. Economic resources in a game are affected by economic functions, which, for example, move them around from place to place. There are typically four main economic functions, so-called sources, which produce resources actually out of nothing, something impossible to get in the real world, but why not in a game world? Contrary to this, drains take resources out of the game or consume them so that resources simply disappear. Converters turn resources of one kind to another kind. For example, turn medical kits into health points. And finally, traders trade resources of one kind to resources of another kind. The difference between traders and converters is that resources of both kinds survive this operation but exchange or swap their position. So this is, for example, a situation in the Monopoly game when you pay money in exchange for houses or hotels or other resources. And this money does not disappear. This money is transferred to a bank, for example. Now, if we have some quantifiable numbers of resources, we now also know how they can be produced, consumed, and transformed, then there should be a way to show long-term changes or trends in the amounts of these resources. In real-life economy, these are so-called economic shapes. For example, this diagram shows the crash on Wall Street exchange in 1929, and this slide seemed to fit perfectly well to this lecture until recently. In 2020, it had to be changed into this slide. Anyway, in games, economic shapes can tell a lot about the history of the gameplay. So here we have two different economic shapes, two different plays. In each place we have two players, or a player and opponent. And we can see that, for example, the first the first game was very successful for the blue player for most of the time. And just in the end game, in the final stage of this game, the fortunes changed and the red player won. The second game seems more exciting, with changing positions of both players. Eventually, the red player won as well. This shape shows a very typical gameplay of chess. First of all, the diagram shows two different resources, a tangible material or pieces, chess pieces, and an abstract resource of advantage, which was measured in some way. I'm not exactly sure how. Initially, in the opening of the game, both players had many pieces and an average advantage. During the opening, both players actually increased their advantage by enhancing, improving their position in the game with some minimal material losses. In the middle game, the advantage of the white player started to be clearly visible, and you can notice also that at this stage of the middle game, the whites had a clear advantage in terms of material, so they simply had more pieces. In the end game, this difference in material was less significant, but the positive feedback, so typical for chess, increased the advantage of the whites and disadvantage of the blacks. In chess, and particularly in the end game, the stronger player tends to get even stronger just because she is in a position to better exploit the overall situation in the game. But in most computer games, it is rather the negative feedback loop that is much more useful, and this is because it leads to an equilibrium or stabilization of the gameplay. For example, this classical game, theoretical game more than a real game, called negative feedback basketball. It differs from a typical basketball in that each time the leading team gets 5 points ahead, the trailing team gets one extra player. So it's a replacing of one resource score by another resource, a player. But if you look at the diagram showing the initial stage of the play, of this gameplay, the poor team was really poor. It increased their score very slowly. But then difference between the teams was stabilized at a distance when where the extra players make up for the lack of skill of the poorer team. So the poor team will be always keep some distance behind the better team, like on a rubber band. And actually this technique, the technique of pulling the winning team back and pushing the losing player forward, is popularly known and described as rubber banding. In Mario Kart, when you managed to get to the first place, it was guaranteed to get punished with all possible types of disasters. On the other hand, when you found yourself in the last position, you would sooner or later get a rocket to overtake all your opponents. This rubber banding was quite often criticized. On the other hand, it had a great potential to enhance engagement by creating longer, more balanced and more diversified plays. Real Racing 2, one of once most popular among mobile racing games, did not have that kind of strong negative feedback. And after exceeding some level of skills, I remember long and lonely drives in the leading position without being even approached by the opponents. Contrary to that, the positive feedback can often lead to arms race and destabilization of gameplay, which can be quite destructive. But when used wisely, it can also substitute for the negative feedback where this latter technique has a weakness. Positive feedback loop can make the end game shorter and more dynamic. With stubborn rubber banding, these endgames might become really long, monotonous and boring, and in this case the positive feedback is the solution. An excellent example we saw in chess and its endgame. There is another quite interesting application for positive feedback. It is where resources can be optionally consumed to trade for another potentially more useful resource. In StarCraft, you have to spend 50 minerals to buy a mining unit called SCV, Space Construction Vehicle. SCVs have an ability to collect even more minerals, but also the ultimate goal of the game is to collect minerals, not SCVs. So you have a dilemma here: to collect as many SCVs as possible, or to stop, say, at 4 and concentrate on collecting minerals. Once again, the economy shapes come with a helping hand. As you can see in the diagram, initially both players, the blue one and the red one, apply the same strategy, collecting as many SCVs as possible in order to increase their productivity. But after acquiring the fourth SCV, the blue player concentrates on collecting minerals, achieving a short-term gain over the red player. However, the red one, occupied with collecting further 2 SCVs, is eventually better off in the long term. But which strategy is actually better, it depends on the gameplay. A dilemma between short-term goals and long-term investments is quite often a crucial point in game strategies. For example, to attack immediately and gain an advantage over unprepared opponent, or rather prepare more units, produce better weapons, but then risk that the opponent did the same thing. The dilemma also occurs in games with a strong career mode. Players can choose between lower quality resources, for example slower cars or less powerful trucks, but receive a reasonably immediate reward, or invest into more valuable resources, faster cars, bigger trucks, but this involves some planning and long-term investments. In this lecture, after some introductory remarks, we spend most of the time on 3 major aspects of the game mechanics: the emergence, the progression, and the game economy. The next lecture, next week, will have a very specific topic: balancing games. Using some of the tools we learned today, we'll see how balancing can be effectively planned and applied at the stage of game design before actual coding. But for today, the agenda is now complete, so thank you very much for watching, and I will see you in the next video.